South Australian Attorney-General Michael Atkinson discussing his reasons for opposing an R18 classification for interactive games in Australia. This is The National Interest on ABC Radio National. To get a gamer's perspective, I'm joined in the studio by David Doe. He's an advocate of an R18 rating for games sold in Australia, and he works for a local game developer, Firemint. David Doe's also behind Gamers4Croydon, a political party that wants to challenge Michael Atkinson in his state seat of Croydon at South Australia's election in March next year. David Doe, welcome to The National Interest.
Thank you for having me.
I think, what's your opinion of this game we mentioned in the introduction, Modern Warfare 2?
Modern Warfare 2 is, by all accounts, the biggest entertainment launch in history. The developers and the publishers should be very proud of the work that they've done in this game. I've seen the objectionable level, which a lot of people will know from the term "remember no Russian," as the Russian terrorists speak to you as you exit a lift and into an airport. That is high.
This is the massacre scene which I've also seen footage of, where basically the player is looking through a gun sight, goes into an airport and shoots a whole lot of people.
That's right. The player has a choice whether or not they want to shoot at the civilians. They're not required to kill the civilians to pass that level. But that level in particular is very confronting content, and it's a reason in itself to have an R18 implemented, because it's just not suitable for 15-year-olds.
So you agree that 15-year-olds shouldn't be able to buy and play this game?
Absolutely.
Now, how many games are entering Australia under an MA rating that you think should be actually 18 plus R rated?
Well, if you look at the numbers from the BBFC, the ESRB, PEGI, and the New Zealand Office of Film and Literature Classification, in the last 5 years we've had 25 games come into Australia and be rated MA15 plus that have been rated R18 or the equivalent in those other areas.
And some of those games, though, are modified for the Australian audience, I think, because of our different rating system.
That's right. Some of them have been modified. I think around 5 or 6 of those games were modified to have an Australian version of the game. And
presumably then the violence was toned down a bit, or the sex, or whatever it was.
Some of them have had the violence toned down, or even just the physics for the ragdolling effect that some of these games contain.
What does that mean?
That is when a body moves around. They have a whole very, very complex set of physics that instruct the body how to move in that environment, and sometimes that will be toned down in order to pass the MA15
So to
rating.
make it less graphic, as it were.
That's right.
Okay. Another game I'm aware of is one called Fallout 3. Can you tell us a bit about that game?
Fallout 3 is set in post-apocalyptic Washington after the nuclear bombs, and it is your role as the character is to survive the wasteland of Washington, D.C., and it's a particularly graphic and violent video game.
And is that available in Australia?
That's freely available under MA15 rating in Australia.
And should it be?
It should be rated R. There's no question about that. The European Games Information Lobby, the BBFC, the ESRB, which is the American lobby, have all rated this game for adults only, and we've rated it MA15 plus.
Well, that would suggest that the Attorney-General from South Australia is right, and that the Classification Review Board isn't doing its job.
I think the Classification Board is doing the best it can. There's obviously a huge commercial interest in the video game industry, and even though Australia is a small market, they're going to try and provide Australians with the type of content that they would like to engage with. So whether or not they're trying to make sure that more games get through into MA15 plus or not, I'm not sure. I don't work there, but I think if we gave them the option of having an R18 rating, they would classify more games as R18 because they have that ability, and then that way people would be more informed as to the type of content that's readily available in those types of games.
The Attorney-General, though, would argue they would also then allow more games into Australia that currently aren't allowed in at all.
Well, he's probably going to make that argument no matter what. I would refute those claims, given that the Classification Guidelines Code explicitly deals with the type of things that Mr. Atkinson was talking about, and that sexual violence and prescribed drug use, for example, are automatically refused classification.
But there are things now, games now, that are refused classification in Australia. That is, they're not allowed in because they can't be classified MA. They can't be classified mature adult for 15-year-olds. And there's no R rating, so they don't get in. Now, some of those games would get in, presumably, in future, and presumably that's what gamers like you want. You want to have access to these games as well.
We want to give people the choice to choose for them, like to give them the opportunity to choose for themselves what the type of content they engage with. So if you're over 18 years old, you should be able to decide for yourself what you think is appropriate. If you're a parent, you should be able to know the type of content that is involved in these games. Whether or not I'm going to play them or lots of people are going to play them, that's really up for the community to decide. No one's going to sit down and force everybody to play these R18 rated games.
And you support those existing restrictions that would apply to if we had an R rating, things like sexual violence, drug use?
Sexual violence, definitely. Drug use is obviously one of the more tricky topics because some drug use will go through and some other drug use won't. And that is a matter for the classification board.
There is also an ability, as I understand it, on consoles, the game consoles, to lock out certain categories of games so that if we had an R rating, you could organise your console at home so R rating games won't work. Now, is that an effective thing, or do kids just know how to get around that sort of stuff?
I know it's absolutely an effective thing. For the parents that know that their console has that functionality, it works. The only way a child would be able to get around it is if the parent told them the password. Every current generation console, the Xbox 360, the PS3, the Wii, and even the PC to an extent, has the ability to restrict access to content based on the guidelines.
So that's another level of control that could be operated if because the Attorney General's argument was that if these games come in and these R-rated games are hanging around the house, then kids are going to use them.
Yeah, that argument doesn't really hold too much water when you look at the R-rated DVDs that are freely available as well. I mean, we want to give parents the opportunity to determine what they think is appropriate for their children. And by letting them know that they have these controls built into all of the current generation consoles is another platform that we'll need to talk about.
Now, we also had a discussion with the Attorney General about how much support there is for this point of view. I quoted a survey. He pointed out that survey was funded by industry. Do most Australians actually even think about these issues?
Most Australians, I think, have played a video game at some point. I would also argue that a lot of Australians just don't know that we don't have an R18 rating for video games. When you point it out, they invariably say, well, why don't we? And then they support the inclusion of an R18 rating because it would reduce confusion at the counter when they're buying it. And
you're going to run a candidate in the South Australian state election on this issue. You're going to stand, or not you personally, but you're looking for someone to stand against Michael Atkinson, as I understand it, in the seat of Croydon. Now, this could be a bit embarrassing if he's proved correct and you don't get any votes. It's going to actually support his view that your cause doesn't have any support and people want these games kept out altogether.
I think there's going to be a lot of different ways to interpret the election results on March 20th. We're definitely going to run a candidate in Croydon, and partially because of the intractability of the Attorney General. He has made it clear that he is immune to popular public support, scientific research and reasoned argument. So he has left us with no other alternative but to run a candidate against him in the seat of Croydon. And as evidenced by his overly smug reference to his 76% of the two-party preferred vote at the last election, and a letter that he sent out to thousands of gamers around Australia saying, well, if you don't like it, run against me. So here I am.
Okay, David Doe, thank you very much for joining me. David Doe is an advocate of an R18 rating for games. He's aiming to start a political party called Gamers4Croydon that will run in the South Australian election and challenge the Attorney General, Michael Atkinson. And we will see whether the Classification Board wants to respond to the South Australian Attorney General's comments on the way it classifies games on a future program. In the meantime, give us your thoughts. Click the Have Your Say button on the website abc.net.au/rn/national interest or call the feedback line 1300 936 222. That's 1300 936 222.